The landing craft hit the sand at 6:30 in the morning, and the men inside them were already dying. Omaha Beach, June 6, 1944. The ramps dropped and the Atlantic swallowed them whole. Not the bullets first, not the bunkers, the water. Men in full combat gear, stepping into nothing, dragged under by the weight of everything the Army had given them to fight with. The ones who made it to the surface came up into a wall of machine gun fire that turned the surf pink before 8 o'clock. The tanks were gone. 27 of 29 DD tanks, the swimming Shermans that were supposed to lead the assault and silence the guns before the infantry arrived, had sunk in the heavy seas miles from shore. 30 tons of steel and hope, straight to the bottom. The men on the beach were alone. Companies of 200 were reduced to a dozen in the first hour. Soldiers pressed themselves flat against a narrow gravel bank and didn't move because moving meant dying. The bluffs above them were untouched, the bunkers unsilenced, the beach obstacles exactly where the Germans had placed them. 50 miles east, something completely different was happening. Strange machines were crawling out of the English Channel onto the British beaches. One had a spinning drum of heavy chains mounted on its nose, beating the sand in front of it, detonating mines in small explosions of dirt and smoke. Another carried a bundle of timber the size of a house on its back, dropped it into an anti-tank ditch, and drove across it in seconds. Another pressed its barrel directly against a concrete bunker wall and fired. The beach was chaos, but it was moving chaos. Men were getting through. The difference between those two beaches came down to one man, a retired corporal, a man the British Army had thrown in the trash, a man named Percy Hobart. Percy Hobart was not an easy man to like. He was demanding, abrasive, and constitutionally incapable of pretending that a stupid idea was anything other than stupid, especially when the stupid idea was coming from a superior officer. He called generals fools to their faces. He interrupted briefings to correct colonels in front of their own men. He had zero patience for cavalry officers who wanted to use tanks like horses, who thought armor was just a faster version of something they already understood. He was right about everything, and he was insufferable about being right. But in the 1930s, Percy Hobart was doing something nobody else in the British Army was doing. He was thinking seriously about how modern war actually worked. He had watched men die in the mud of the Western Front in 1917 and 18, not because they lacked courage, but because doctrine hadn't caught up with technology. He decided tanks were the future. Not tanks as infantry support, not tanks as a supplement to the cavalry charge, but tanks as the primary instrument of battle, moving fast, striking deep, coordinating at speed in ways that paralyzed an enemy before they could respond. He built the first tank brigade from scratch. He ran exercises on Salisbury Plain that left observing officers speechless, entire armored formations operating independently, striking flank and rear simultaneously, doing in practice what the textbook said was impossible. Then, in 1938, they sent him to Egypt, and he built the 7th Armored Division, the unit that would later be called the Desert Rats, into the finest armored force Britain had. And then the War Office brought him home, wrote a report criticizing his methods and his personality, and in 1940, with German panzers already pouring through the Ardennes, they forced him out. Percy Hobart, the man who had spent 20 years trying to teach the British Army how to fight a modern war, was now a corporal in the Home Guard, guarding a village, watching the sky for German planes that never came. On the 19th of August, 1942, 3,600 Canadian soldiers landed on the beaches at Dieppe, France. It was supposed to be a raid, a proof of concept, a demonstration that the Allies could strike the European coast and withdraw on their terms. It lasted 9 hours. More than half the men who landed were killed, wounded, or captured before the day was done. The tanks that were supposed to support them got stuck on the beach shingle, couldn't climb the seawall, and sat burning in the open while infantry died around them. The lesson was written in blood. Fortified beaches didn't fall to courage. They fell to the right tools, and nobody had the right tools. Churchill read the Dieppe report. He asked why the tanks had failed. He asked what it would take to get armor off a beach and into a fight. Someone in the room mentioned a name? Hobart. Churchill knew the name. He asked why Hobart was retired. He was told about the personality, the methods, the difficulty. Churchill's response was short. He didn't want officers who explained why things couldn't be done. He wanted officers who figured out how. He called Hobart back personally, gave him a division, the 79th Armored, and a mission unlike anything in military history. Study every way a fortified beach can kill a man. Then build a machine to stop it. Hobart was 57 years old. He had spent 2 years guarding English lanes in a corporal's uniform, while the army he built fought without him. Now Churchill was handing him the hardest engineering problem of the war and a deadline that didn't move. They gave him a division, a deadline, and a problem nobody had ever solved. Build machines that could crack open a fortified beach. Make them work by June 1944. Hobart looked at his engineers and said, "Let's start." Hobart started with the worst problem first. Mines. A beach covered in buried explosives stops everything. Infantry can't cross it. Tanks can't cross it. Engineers on their hands and knees, with probes move at the speed of terror, a few yards an hour under fire. Hobart looked at the problem and built the crab. A Sherman tank with a rotating drum of heavy chains bolted to its front, spinning at speed, beating the ground in front of the tank as it advanced. The chains detonated the mines before the tank rolled over them, small explosions in the dirt, harmless from inside the steel. The first time the engineers tested it with live mines, the chains hit and the ground erupted in a line of sharp cracks, and the tank rolled through untouched. The men watching didn't speak for a moment. Then someone started laughing. The second problem was concrete. German bunkers were built to absorb everything a standard tank gun could deliver. Hobart's answer was the AVRE, an Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers, a Churchill tank with its main gun replaced by a petard mortar that fired a 40-pound demolition charge they called the Flying Dustbin. It didn't penetrate concrete. It didn't need to. It transferred enough force through the wall to kill everyone inside. The third problem was the anti-tank ditch, a trench cut across the beach approach, wide enough that no vehicle could cross it. Hobart built the Fascine carrier, a tank that carried an enormous bundle of wooden poles, dropped it into the ditch on approach, and drove across in seconds. Then the seawall. The arc tank drove to its base and deployed ramps from its own hull, becoming a bridge that other vehicles drove over. On paper, it looked like a circus. In practice, it was the most sophisticated assault engineering system ever built. And every single one of those strange, ugly, impossible machines existed because one retired general refused to accept that men had to die for lack of the right tool. Before the invasion was launched, the Americans were offered the funnies. General Omar Bradley's planners sat across from British officers who explained the flail tanks, the AVREs, the Fascine carriers, the whole system Hobart had built. Bradley accepted the DD swimming tanks and declined the rest. The reasoning wasn't arrogance exactly. Training time was short. Integrating foreign equipment into American assault doctrine was genuinely complicated. The DD tanks alone required months of crew training. There wasn't time to learn everything. It was a reasonable decision. It was catastrophic. On the morning of June 6th, the DD tanks assigned to Omaha were launched 6,000 yards from shore, far beyond the distance they had been tested at, into seas running 4 to 5 feet. 27 of 29 sank before they reached the beach. The 2 that survived did so because their commanders ignored the launch order and drove them directly off the landing craft onto the sand. The infantry arrived on an undefended beach with no armor, no mine clearing, no way to breach the obstacles, no way to silence the bunkers on the bluffs above them. By mid-morning, the casualty rate in some companies exceeded 90%. On Gold Beach, 50 miles east, British infantry landed behind crab flail tanks that cleared the mines in front of them. A VRS silenced the bunkers. Fascines bridged the ditches. Arcs scaled the seawalls. The beach was defended just as fiercely. The guns were just as real. But the tools worked, and the men moved. British casualties at Gold Beach on June 6th were approximately 400. American casualties at Omaha were approximately 2,000. The machines Hobart built were not magic. They could not stop every bullet or silence every gun. But on the beaches where they worked, men lived who would otherwise have died. On the beach where they didn't, the sea ran red until noon. The 79th Armored Division didn't stop at the beaches. Hobart's machines fought through every major obstacle in the Northwest Europe campaign. They breached the Siegfried Line. They crossed the Rhine. Every fortress, every ditch, every minefield that stood between the Allied armies, and Berlin met something Hobart had already designed a solution for. The funnies served until the last shot of the war in Europe, and when it was over, Eisenhower said the specialized armor had been one of the decisive factors in the success of the landings. Not a contributing factor, a decisive one. Hobart received a knighthood. The same institution that had retired him recalled him, handed him an impossible mission, and watched him deliver it on time, gave him a title, and quietly returned to ignoring everything he had spent his life arguing. The post-war British Army did not reorganize itself around his theories. It did not build monuments to what the 79th had proven. It moved on, the way institutions always move on, toward comfort, toward familiarity, toward the men who fit the system, rather than the men who improved it. But the system doesn't get the final word. History does. The generals who signed Hobart's retirement papers are forgotten. The report that called him difficult, unorthodox, unsuitable for command is a footnote nobody reads. What remains is the number, the difference between 400 and 2,000. The men who walked off Gold Beach alive because a spinning drum of chains cleared the ground in front of them. The men who made it past the seawall because a tank became a bridge. They never knew his name. Most of them never would. But they were walking because of him. The Army forced him out because he was difficult. History remembers him because he was right. And that, in the end, is the only verdict that matters.